Hi, welcome back. I hope that was an interesting example for you. So now what we're going to do is finish off chapter one. And what's remaining in chapter one is we have to think about what the discipline of finance is, what its three primary areas of operations are, and one of them is going to be business finance. Then we'll look a little bit in depth into some aspects of the implications of business finance. And then finally, we will end with some interesting topical things that have come up that have to do with business finance in the real world. Okay, so as always, without any further ado, let's jump right in. Okay, so we left off with our epilogue on the HCP example, and that was on page 17 of the handout. And now we're going to start with page 18 on key aspects of finance. And the first thing we want to answer is the eternal question, what is finance? And as in the case with many things, the answer to the question, what is it, depends on who you ask. And there are a lot of different answers you get. But in general, for finance, there's pretty much a consensus that finance is a discipline describing for an entity, meaning a business or a government or something like that, the management of its money, its management of its money, its banking, and its assets, liabilities, and equity. And also the marketplace's view of these items and the entity's management of these items. So in the broadest sense, that's what finance is and what it covers. So this is going to imply that it includes looking at financial instruments for entities and for governments and for individuals. We have two key types of financial instruments. One is sets of contracts between borrowers and lenders, and these are loans and bonds. Bonds, as we learned in the example, are contracts. Loans are always contracts. And other financial instruments, very important, our second type, are ownership rights to an entity. These are stocks. Important to know that stocks are not contracts. Nothing is guaranteed with stock. A stock is just a certificate of partial ownership of an entity, period. And the study of finance is also going to include the analysis of derivatives that are related to financial instruments. So what are derivatives, you may ask, and that would be a good question. Derivatives are contracts that specify cash flows relative to stocks, bonds, or loans. And we'll look a little bit in the next chapter at how some derivatives work. There's three key types of derivative contracts. These are options, futures, and credit default swaps. In this class, we're only going to get as far as options and futures, and we'll leave credit default swaps to more advanced classes. So now that we have a sense of what finance is in its broadest terms, in its overall domain, within that domain there are three primary branches. And the first one is public and quasi-public finance. And that just means we're going to be thinking about the finance of governments and government agencies. So for example, we could be looking at the US federal government, which has about right now 3.2 trillion in annual revenue. We could be looking at the government agency, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, which has about 4 billion in annual revenue these days. Or we could be looking at something very small, like the municipality of Oxford, Ohio. So just to be clear on what a government agency is, for example, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey was set up by the state of New York in conjunction with the state of New Jersey to build and manage transit paths from New York to New Jersey. So for example, the George Washington Bridge, which goes between New Jersey and Manhattan, is one of these conduits, and it was developed by, it's owned by, and it's managed by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, which is a government agency for the governments of both New York and New Jersey. Second big tranche of finance is what's called typically corporate finance or business finance. Okay. Typically, for whatever reason, in undergraduate courses, it's called business finance. In MBA classes, it's called corporate finance. Essentially means the same thing. This is the portion of finance that is going to focus on privately owned entities, so not government entities or government agencies, but it will include for-profit firms and not-for-profit firms. So those of you who are interested in working for nonprofits, don't fear, this class is going to be very helpful to you. So for example, we could be looking at Walmart is a very large privately owned entity, and privately owned just means not owned by the government. Walmart, as many of you may know, is what's called a publicly held entity. It just means that the ownership stakes of Walmart, its shares of stock, are traded on public markets, and anyone can buy or sell ownership stakes in Walmart. But it's still private in the sense that it's not government. Okay, and another example would be Exxon Mobil. Exxon Mobil has about 500 billion in annual revenue, so these are very big companies. On the other hand, we could look at Satriale's Butcher Shop in northern New Jersey, which was featured famously in The Sopranos and would have something like about 120,000 in annual revenue. So both of these companies have publicly traded shares of stock. Satriale's does not, but they're all privately owned entities in the sense that they are not owned by a government, a state government, a federal government, etc. And then finally, we could look at something like the Joffrey Ballet Company in New York. This is a privately owned entity, which is a not-for-profit firm, but it's also going to be considered part of the domain of corporate or business finance. And the third main area of finance is personal finance. And personal finance is focused on the finances of individuals and families. So that's going to be looking at things like for the parents in a family of five, say, how can we safely get to retirement, help our children get through college along the way, make sure that we have a lifestyle that we're going to enjoy in retirement and not run out of money before we die, which is sort of the key goal of retirement planning. So the financial planners will work with you in personal finance to think about things like your time horizon, how much time do you have till retirement, and what kind of requirements for income are you going to have in retirement, well, what may happen macroeconomically that might throw you off, et cetera, et cetera. So it's all about that kind of stuff, and primarily the domain of financial planners and folks like that. Okay, our emphasis in this course is on corporate finance, which again is the same as business finance. Okay, and we're going to be looking mostly at for-profit firms. And again, if you're interested in nonprofit firms, don't worry, because everything we look at for for-profit firms pretty much applies directly to nonprofit firms. Okay, and I would say the next big question up after what is finance is the next eternal question, which is why should we care? Why do we care about finance? Why are we being tortured with this stuff if we're not finance majors in particular? Well, there are at least a few reasons for that. Number one, from my perspective, is finance gives you a great framework for understanding the world, which is probably very different than any framework you've looked at before. I consider myself extraordinarily lucky to have learned a framework for viewing the world, identifying problems, analyzing problems, solving problems through my engineering education, and then getting a very, very different framework vis-a-vis how to identify, analyze, solve problems when I got my MBA. So I think it's always a good idea to get new and different frameworks for viewing the world and solving problems, and finance is definitely a great one. Okay. Also, knowledge of finance, whether or not you're a finance major, can help you get a great job. Even if you're not a finance major, understanding of finance gives you a competitive advantage vis-a-vis others. If you're going into marketing, even if you're going into coding, you're going to be coding stuff that has to do with finance. And if you understand the finance, you have a leg up on your peers, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, knowing about finance, even though we're largely focused on corporate finance or business finance this term, it's going to be very helpful to help you increase your personal wealth. And I think the HCP example illustrated that pretty clearly. And a lot of other examples we look at will do the same. Okay, so also related to why should you care about finance, I hope that some of you are going to love it so much like me that you're going to consider a career in the field. And the field of finance is very broad as far as careers go. There are a lot of exciting things you can do. So right off the top, you could be a CFO, a chief financial officer. That's a great way to rise to the top of a company without having all the headaches of being a CEO and dealing directly with shareholders and analysts, et cetera, the way a CEO has to. You could be a stock or bond analyst where you're focused on looking at one company's equity and asking the question, should our company or should our customers buy this stock? And if so, why? And if not, why not? That type of thing. And same thing with bonds. That's very, very interesting. You can learn a lot by doing that. And related to that is becoming something like a mutual fund manager or hedge fund manager, where you're taking whole portfolios of these stocks and bonds and trying to combine an optimal mix of stocks and bonds that's going to make your customers and you as much money as possible, being as safe as you need to be given your mission. You could be a stock or bond broker, which is all about helping people buy and sell the bonds and stocks that they are interested in. You could be a financial planner. That would be, again, mostly focused on personal finances, but that's very, very interesting work too. You could go into what I think is maybe one of the most interesting areas in finance altogether, private equity, where your mission in life is to identify companies that are, for whatever reason, not performing optimally and going in and buying them, hopefully at a low price, morphing them into awesome, optimally run firms, and then selling them. So you learn an enormous amount about companies and how they work in that field. And you can also, of course, make a lot of money in private equity. And also you could go into financial risk management, where you basically help all of the above folks to make sure when they make a move, they're thinking about what could happen if things go well, okay, or badly, what's the probability in each case, and what's that going to do to their wealth or their customers' wealth in each case, and how to manage that. That's very quantitative mathematical stuff, but that's also extremely fun if you like math. And I'm going to look at examples that illustrate all of these career paths as we go through the term. And I've got to say, one reason that I do not like the Brigham text so much, or virtually most of the undergraduate texts that I've seen for corporate finance or business finance, is because they tend to focus exclusively from the perspective of a CFO of a large publicly traded entity. And don't get me wrong, again, I think that's great. It's listed here as my first great career opportunity in finance, but I think especially at an undergraduate level, that's a huge mistake. And what we really should be doing at an undergraduate level is showing you all these interesting types of jobs that you could go into and what are the types of financial problems that they address. So with that in mind, with my textbook, I've organized it in that way, so that if you, for example, are interested in investment management, you can look at the HCP example in Chapter 1, the collapse of Fannie Mae in Chapter 3, the balance sheet valuation method in Chapter 8, etc. If you're interested in private equity, you can look at examples in Chapter 19 and Chapter 22. If you're interested in risk modeling, you can look at these examples for example, probabilistic risk and the CAPM model in Chapter 16 and 17. If you're interested in real estate and real estate investment trusts, I've got examples for you. And if you're interested in asset-backed securities and securitization. So just a little plug for my text and the way that it's organized. So that was clearly self-serving and gratuitous. So let's move beyond that. Okay, a few more things I've got there that you could be interested in that are where I've got examples, simple examples that are relevant in my text. All right, so enough of that. Let's move on to now, let's focus more clearly, more directly on business finance, corporate finance, and think about the role of businesses in society, because that's going to be foundational to everything that we do for the rest of the term. So like I said, we're going to be focused on mostly for-profit businesses, which are called entities. Entities, businesses, same thing. They're just synonyms, okay? All right, so all for-profit businesses are making either things or providing services for consumers, businesses, or the government. And to survive, they've only got to do two things in America. Okay, it's different in other countries, but in America, they've only got to do two things. One is you've got to make more cash than you spend, okay, if you're a business in America. Otherwise, if you don't, you're going to run out of cash, and that's what causes you to go bankrupt. So you will go bankrupt. And the second thing that you have to do in America is you have to follow the applicable laws. And if you don't, you might find yourself in jail for the rest of your life. They have here pictured Bernie Madoff, who was running the biggest pyramid scheme that's been seen as of yet in the 21st century. And he swindled people out of literally billions of dollars, and he's in jail for the rest of his life. Okay, so those are the two things you have to do if you're a business to survive in this country. You can also, of course, choose to do a lot of other things. So, for example, you can choose to operate in just certain industries, markets, or market niches. So Ford Motor Company, for example, says, we're just going to make cars and trucks, right? And very soon, they're going to be making nothing but trucks and the Ford Mustang. So they're going to be focusing on trucks. If we look at Sahali Snacks, for example, Sahali Snacks has said, we're going to make healthy nut-based snacks, and that's all we're going to do. So that's a choice of those companies. By contrast, okay, conglomerate companies have chosen to operate in several or many industries. So a couple examples of conglomerates are first General Electric, which until very recently operated in 4 discrete areas: energy, technology, infrastructure, capital finance, and consumer. And they've recently jettisoned their capital finance business, but they're still a conglomerate. They still operate in 3 distinct areas. And Apple is also a conglomerate that has chosen to compete in several areas and industries, right? On the one hand, they make PC hardware and software. And on the other hand, they make mobile hardware and software, phones and smartwatches, and soon they're having an augmented reality system coming out. And also, they're in the music distribution business. I leave out the TV business because it's so small for Apple. So these are choices of the corporation. You are free to decide how big or how small your domain of operations is going to be. So businesses can also choose to maximize their value to owners. And I put this here, this is very important because this is a choice, okay? Maximizing shareholder value is a choice. It's not something that a for-profit business has to do. And important to note that when we say value, we mean a measure of the firm's worth, and the firm's worth is measured by what someone would pay for 100% of the firm, 100% of the stock. Okay. And businesses can all, like, just for example, while I'm here, many businesses do choose to maximize shareholder value, but many don't. And Google famously, when it started out, its mission statement didn't say anything about shareholder value. Its mission statement was 3 words long: don't be evil. Okay. And they've morphed a lot around since then, but at the time they were definitely not focused on shareholder value. Businesses also, of course, can choose to perform a civic good or to maximize their value to all of their stakeholders, not just their shareholders, right? Stakeholders of the firm include employees, include customers, include residences nearby where they operate, where they have factories or where their headquarters building is located, that sort of thing. Also, civic goods could include minimizing pollution or greenhouse emissions, contributing to charities, giving discounts to schools, and putting forward diversity policies, that sort of thing, and also deciding to follow the spirit of the law instead of simply just the letter of the law. Okay, so these are all choices for corporate entities in America. Okay, after you do the 2 things that you need to do, make more cash than you spend and follow applicable laws, the rest are choices. Okay, and on the subject of maximizing shareholder value versus maximizing stakeholder value, this is very topical right now. In the fall of 2019, the Business Roundtable fired a shot heard round the corporate world when it said for the first time, we believe that the most important thing is not to maximize shareholder value, which was their position for a very long time. And the Business Roundtable includes 20 or so of the largest publicly traded corporations in America. So they said for the first time, instead of saying that maximizing shareholder value is our most important thing, they're saying maximizing stakeholder value is the most important thing. And here's a picture of Jamie Dimon, who was head of the Business Roundtable at the time. And we've got a good article on this for you here. And we've got the purpose of a corporation. No longer should decisions be based solely on whether they will yield higher profits for shareholders. Rather, corporate leaders should take into account all stakeholders, employees, customers, and society writ large. So I've got this whole article and a couple of other articles talking about the implications of this change on Canvas in the additional resources section. So you can look at that if you're interested. Okay, so what are we going to do for the rest of the term here? Well, again, we're going to focus mostly on corporate finance, okay, and mostly for-profit entities. And within that galaxy of operations, we're going to whittle it down a little bit further. So we're going to look at firms that choose to follow the law. When you get into your B-Law courses, you can look at some firms that don't choose to do that and what happens to them as a consequence. We are going to look at firms that are aiming to maximize their value. Again, I'm not saying that this is the best thing for firms to do. It just simplifies our work in this introductory course. And we're also going to primarily look at firms that operate in a specific industry or market niche. Now, very important question, I think, related to this notion of maximizing value is, does that preclude contributing to the common good? And I've had a bunch of great discussions with students about this, and I'd be very interested to know what you feel if you want to post to the Chapter 1 discussions forum some of your thoughts on this. But it's my very strong view that firms that choose to maximize their value are not in any way precluding their being contributors to the common good. I think Apple is a very good example of this. Apple is very much focused on maximizing its value, and it does an awful lot of things for the common good, from diversity to helping schools to helping the environment, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that they are not mutually exclusive. That's my opinion. I'd be very interested in knowing yours if you want to post on that in the discussions forum for Chapter 1. Okay, and that's going to wrap it up for our Chapter 1 lectures. So I'm going to sign out now, let you get through the rest of the module, and see you in the discussions forums in office hours or again in the video for Chapter 2. Okay, take care.